U.S. President Donald Trump has consistently expressed a confrontational stance toward the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, particularly concerning their efforts to diminish the dominance of the U.S. dollar in global trade. His position is underscored by a series of statements and policy threats aimed at deterring any initiatives that could undermine the dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency. In November 2024, prior to his inauguration for a second term, Trump issued a stark warning to the BRICS countries regarding their discussions about creating a new currency to supplant the U.S. dollar. He stated, "We are going to require a commitment from these seemingly hostile countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty U.S. dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs." This declaration highlighted his intent to use significant economic measures to prevent any shift away from the dollar in international trade. Trump's rhetoric intensified in early 2025. In a January 31st post on Truth Social, he reiterated his opposition to the BRICS currency plans. The idea that the BRICS countries are trying to move away from the dollar, while we stand by and watch, is over. He further emphasized the potential economic consequences for nations attempting to replace the U.S. dollar. There is no chance that BRICS will replace the U.S. dollar in international trade or anywhere else, and any country that tries should say hello to tariffs and goodbye to America. By February 2025, Trump proclaimed the ineffectiveness of the BRICS alliance, asserting, "BRICS is dead since I mentioned that. BRICS died the minute I mentioned that." He dismissed the notion that the BRICS nations held any leverage over the United States, stating, "They don't have us over a barrel, we have them over a barrel." Upon resuming office, Trump translated his rhetoric into policy. On February 13, 2025, he announced, "If any trading gets through, it'll be 100% tariff at least." This statement was directed at deterring the BRICS nations from pursuing their own currency initiatives. Instead of responding with direct criticism, BRICS is focusing on expanding partnerships and strengthening monetary sovereignty through practical initiatives. Central to this is BRICS Pay, a decentralized cross-border payment system aimed at reducing reliance on the U.S. dollar and SWIFT by enabling transactions in local currencies. Rather than pursuing a single BRICS currency, the bloc is prioritizing financial interoperability through projects like China's CIPS and India's UPI. This approach supports regional integration while sidestepping traditional Western-dominated systems. BRICS is also deepening ties with countries in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, and advancing initiatives like regional development banks and the proposed BRICS grain exchange to build a resilient economic alternative. Officials, including Russia's Dmitry Peskov, clarified that BRICS isn't trying to disrupt existing institutions but to rebalance global finance through local currency trade and joint investments. This strategy reflects a long-term shift toward multipolar financial governance rooted in sovereignty and equity. However, one of the key countermeasures taken by BRICS has been to move away from relying on the World Bank and the IMF. Before diving into the details, let's first explore why BRICS and the Global South are dissatisfied with these institutions. World Bank or U.S. Bank? Since its establishment in 1944, the World Bank has consistently appointed leaders from the United States. This enduring pattern reveals a deeply entrenched bias that undermines the organization's legitimacy, particularly in its engagements with the Global South, the very regions it professes to support. From its first president, Eugene Meyer, to the current head, Ajay Banga, the bank has adhered to the tradition of selecting an American citizen as its leader. This unwritten rule reflects U.S. dominance, bolstered by its role as the largest shareholder. The implications are far-reaching. An American monopoly on leadership suggests inherent favoritism toward the United States' political and economic interests. Decisions on development aid and structural reform often promote a Western-style neoliberal agenda. This model has drawn criticism for enforcing austerity and privatization, which tend to heighten inequality and hinder sustainable progress in the Global South. The absence of leadership diversity reinforces the image of the World Bank as a Western-driven entity rather than a truly global institution. For countries in the Global South, the main recipients of aid, The lack of leadership that reflects their lived experiences sparks concerns over fair representation. U.S. dominance ensures that policy direction often favors Western priorities instead of adapting to the complex needs of borrower nations. As an example, World Bank projects are often accused of promoting trade liberalization or resource extraction that benefits multinational corporations more than local development initiatives. IMF for Europe? Like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund has played a central role in global economic affairs since 1944. Its leadership tradition is equally narrow, with Europeans always holding the position of managing director. From Camille Gut of Belgium to Kristalina Georgieva of Bulgaria, the trend underscores Europe's sustained influence. This leadership structure has supported a policy bias that favors Western economic models centered on fiscal discipline. Programs routinely emphasize austerity, privatization, and deregulation, mirroring the interests of advanced European economies over those of developing nations. The consistent selection of European leaders has entrenched a structural bias that sidelines the voices of emerging economies. Despite claiming a global purpose, the IMF lacks diversity in its leadership, particularly from regions most affected by its policies. The tacit US-Europe alliance in dividing leadership between the IMF and World Bank has created a power-sharing structure that centralizes authority within the West. This has left out nations from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, perpetuating a legacy of economic control reminiscent of colonial dynamics in global financial governance. BRICS countries have long pushed for overhauling institutions like the IMF and World Bank to better reflect the rise of emerging economies. At the 6th BRICS Summit in 2014, leaders voiced frustration over stalled IMF reforms from 2010, arguing that the delay damages the institution's credibility, legitimacy, and operational relevance. In October 2024, Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov asserted, "The IMF and the World Bank are not doing their jobs. They don't operate in the interests of BRICS countries." He urged the creation of new institutions to cater to BRICS-specific goals, claiming the current global financial system remains under the control of Western powers. At the 16th BRICS Summit held in Kazan, Russia, in October 2024, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva highlighted the new development bank as a purposeful alternative to what he called the failing Bretton Woods institutions. He also stressed the urgency of developing independent payment systems to reduce reliance on Western-led financial structures. Why are so many nations disillusioned with institutions like the IMF? To answer that, it's important to first understand what constitutes a fair loan. A fair loan includes terms that promote sustainable growth without placing undue pressure on the borrower. Such terms involve moderate interest rates, adaptable repayment timelines, transparent agreements, limited conditionality, and a developmental outlook. In contrast, an unfair loan brings rigid terms. High interest rates, inflexible repayment structures, opaque policies, and stringent demands that often lead to economic hardship and diminished sovereignty. The IMF's structural adjustment model focuses on stabilizing economies through programs that mandate austerity, privatization, and liberalization. Although intended to reduce deficits and curb inflation, these measures can erode autonomy and worsen social conditions. The IMF's one-size-fits-all prescriptions often disregard national contexts, resulting in debt traps and failing to solve deep-rooted economic problems. In contrast, the BRICS-led New Development Bank, created in 2015, supports infrastructure and sustainability with borrower-friendly terms. The NDB demands fewer policy conditions and offers more flexibility, allowing greater control for borrowing nations. It prioritizes cooperation and transparency, tailoring its programs to each nation's context. However, as a newer entity, it has limited experience and still faces hurdles in ensuring fairness among BRICS countries. BRICS members argue that reform should align with today's global realities. They claim that institutions like the IMF and WTO largely favor developed nations and often neglect the needs of the global South. Key demands include revising the IMF's quota system for more equitable influence and reinstating the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism. Driven by these frustrations, many global South countries are striving to replace or reimagine the current financial order. Now we examine country-specific cases to understand how IMF loans have sometimes caused serious problems. let's take a quick pause. If you've enjoyed the video so far, could we ask a small favor? Hitting the like button helps us reach a broader audience, and sharing your thoughts or feedback in the comments makes an even bigger impact. Thank you for watching. Now, let's dive back in. During the 1980s, Nigeria's economy was under strain, with debt rising and oil revenues falling. Under General Ibrahim Babangida, the nation adopted a structural adjustment program in 1986 with IMF support. The policy aimed to diversify the economy but also devalued the currency and eliminated subsidies, resulting in inflation and higher living costs. This sparked mass protests in 1989, known as the anti-SAP riots, which began at the University of Benin and spread nationwide. Demonstrators united across cities like Lagos and Ibadan, leading to military crackdowns and casualties. Although some view these reforms as necessary, the short-term social damage, rising poverty service cuts and civil unrest, was immense and deeply destabilizing. Indonesia, hit hard by the 1997 Asian financial crisis, sought a $43 billion IMF bailout. The required austerity led to widespread discontent and rioting in May 1998. Protests, often targeting elites and minority communities, turned violent, especially in Jakarta. The government's harsh response killed many. Estimates go beyond 1,000. President Suharto resigned shortly after. These events ushered in democratic reforms but also left a lasting skepticism toward the IMF and its role during the crisis. In 1977, subsidy cuts on food led to massive protests known as the bread riots. The IMF-backed decision to reduce public subsidies caused prices to spike on staples, sparking unrest in major cities. Riots escalated into attacks on infrastructure and public institutions. The military was deployed, and dozens were killed. Public resistance eventually forced the government to restore subsidies. This episode underscored the political risk of applying IMF conditions without cushioning the public. In the late 1990s, Brazil accepted a $41.5 billion IMF package that required strict fiscal austerity. The government cut spending on services like education and healthcare, triggering protests and social backlash. While critics argue these measures increased poverty, others claim they stabilized the economy. Brazil paid off its IMF loans in 2005, regaining financial independence, though the social cost remains part of the ongoing debate on austerity's long-term viability. Morocco's agreement with the IMF in 1981 resulted in steep food price hikes after subsidies were cut. The Casablanca bread riots followed, with protesters targeting banks, shops, and vehicles. The crackdown was severe. Officially 66 deaths, though some reports say over 600. The episode exposed how austerity can inflame unrest in societies dependent on subsidized goods, and served as a warning about imposing reforms without considering local conditions. In 1989, economic reforms under IMF guidance triggered El Caracazo, a violent protest across the country. Fare increases sparked riots, looting, and a brutal crackdown. The episode shattered faith in established politics and fueled the rise of Hugo Chavez, who capitalized on anti-IMF sentiment. This moment remains pivotal in Venezuela's modern history and showcases the volatility of sudden IMF-backed economic shifts. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has long been a source of criticism from Global South nations, particularly for policies that have often exacerbated economic hardship rather than alleviating it. One of the most contentious aspects has been the implementation of structural adjustment programs, SAPs, during the 1980s and 1990s. These programs prioritized austerity, deregulation, and the liberalization of trade and investment, often at the expense of local development needs. While intended to stabilize macroeconomic conditions, they frequently resulted in reduced government spending on essential services like healthcare, education, and social safety nets, worsening poverty and increasing vulnerability among already disadvantaged populations. A central concern has been the erosion of national sovereignty. Countries seeking IMF assistance are typically required to adopt pre-designed policy frameworks, leaving little room for locally tailored solutions. This top-down approach has led to growing resentment, as governments often face domestic backlash for implementing externally imposed reforms that may not align with their socio-economic realities or developmental goals. Another long-standing issue is the IMF's governance structure, which allocates voting power based on a country's financial contribution. This system disproportionately favors wealthier, developed nations, particularly the United States and European powers, while marginalizing the voices of poorer countries. As a result, the Global South has limited influence over decision-making, even though it is often most affected by IMF policies. Additionally, the IMF's approach to debt management has come under fire. Many critics argue that its restructuring mechanisms are insufficient and frequently result in long-term debt dependency. Borrowing nations often find themselves trapped in cycles of loans and repayments, with little progress toward achieving financial independence or sustainable development. In the absence of fair and transparent global debt frameworks, countries are left with limited options for relief. The social consequences of IMF-led fiscal consolidation are also severe. Budget cuts mandated under loan conditions often lead to significant reductions in public investment in health, education, and infrastructure. These measures disproportionately affect the most vulnerable, widening inequalities and undermining long-term development potential. In many cases, the perceived legitimacy of the IMF is further damaged by the visible decline in living standards that accompanies its interventions. The relationship between Donald Trump and the BRICS bloc remains tense and complex, marked by sharp rhetoric and strategic divergence. Since his re-election, Trump has taken a confrontational stance toward BRICS, particularly criticizing its initiatives that challenge U.S. financial dominance. Central to BRICS's efforts is the development of its own cross-border payment system, often referred to as BRICS Pay, which aims to reduce reliance on SWIFT and facilitate trade in local currencies rather than the U.S. dollar. This shift aligns with a broader strategy to enhance monetary sovereignty and create a parallel global financial framework less susceptible to Western influence. Trump has responded with threats of 100% tariffs on BRICS nations should they move further toward establishing alternatives to the dollar. However, BRICS has largely avoided direct confrontation, instead quietly expanding its financial tools and partnerships with other emerging economies. The bloc's increasing use of local currencies in trade and investment is not just symbolic, it has the potential to gradually erode the dollar's role as the dominant global reserve currency over time. Yet, the long-term impact of this evolving dynamic is difficult to predict. While Trump's aggressive posture may push BRICS members to accelerate their decoupling from the dollar-based system, the U.S. still holds significant economic leverage. The global financial system remains deeply entrenched in dollar liquidity, and any large-scale transition will take time, institutional support, and widespread adoption. In conclusion, the Trump-BRICS relationship reflects a broader shift in the global order, where emerging powers are seeking greater autonomy and influence. While it is too early to determine how this will ultimately reshape the global financial landscape, the creation of BRICS-led alternatives to SWIFT and the increasing use of local currencies mark a serious challenge to the dollar's long-held supremacy and signal a new chapter in the contest over global economic leadership. What do you think of these developments? Write your thoughts in the comment. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching this video. We sincerely appreciate you joining us today. If our content resonated with you or sparked inspiration, please consider expressing your support by liking it and subscribing to stay connected with our community. Your support holds immense value for us. You can watch another video of our channel, which is now on the screen.